Good evening, everyone. It is truly a blessing to be here with you. Thank you, Nate, for your thoughts. Very well said. You hit the nail on the head about what I think the major themes of this are, and replacement is definitely a major theme, and we'll talk about that some more as we get into this. So this starts a new section, a new team. We've just gone through the law that's being given to Moses, and we've had several talks about the meaning behind those. And now we're back to what we might call the plot of the story here, now that we've gone through that. Moses is up on the mountain, and if we could put maybe a subtitle on this section, it's Meanwhile down below. So Moses is up there receiving these laws that we've learned about, and so now we get a glimpse into what's going on in the meantime. And as Nate has talked about and what we've read, this starts with the golden calf, and this section will run through Exodus 32 through the beginning of Exodus 35. Now this is there's a lot of material in those few chapters, and we only have 3 Wednesday nights to cover this before the next team takes over, and I think Mike has labeled that team Team Tabernacle. So then you get all the instructions for the building of the tabernacle and the worship involved there. So we get 3 Wednesday nights to cover this part of plot here, and there's a lot that goes on. Truly, and maybe everybody says this when it's their turn to talk, but just this one chapter, we could probably spend 3 nights or maybe 3 months. There is a lot here. And so obviously we won't be able to get to a lot of it. We're going to spend a majority of our time this evening here in this beginning part examining this golden calf and some of the things going on here. And then we'll pick up speed this evening and go through the rest of the events of the chapter. And hopefully you'll see these themes jump out, and that will set our roadmap for what the final 2 lessons of this will be. And then we'll see how that plays into the next team that talks about the tabernacle. So we'll see these things start to play through. So tonight we're talking about the golden calf, and I've titled it Fabricating an Image of God. And we've already read in Exodus 32, those first few verses, what's happened here. My goodness. They've seen the plagues. They've gone through the desert. They've had victories. They've seen these miraculous things. They've seen the cloud lead them during the day, the pillar of fire at night. They've seen the sea split. All these amazing things that they've seen. And if you're like me, the first question that comes to mind about this is, what were they thinking? In chapter 19, they hear God, the thunderings and the lightnings, and they hear the 10 commandments. Also around then, Moses gathers the elders of Israel, and basically they all agree in unison, unanimously, whatever God says we will do. And then they hear the 10 commandments. Included in that is the do not make a graven image. And so here we are just a few days later. What on earth were they thinking? Now, we have a danger here of really looking at this group of people and just thinking, man, what a bunch of idiots. They really lost the plot quick, didn't they? I want to take a few moments to examine what they were probably thinking. In Exodus 13, verse 21, just to reiterate some of the things that they've seen in Exodus 13:21, and the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light. And all the people answered together in Exodus 19, as we talked about. They all answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. So they agree to this covenant here. And then Exodus 20, verse 18. When they were hearing those 10 commandments, they weren't really listening, I don't think. I think they were a bit occupied. Now, when all the people saw the thunder and flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled, and they stood afar off. So you would think the last thing on their mind would be to make this idol, this golden calf. Well, we see from the text that they felt leaderless and lost. 40 days and 40 nights into this ordeal, Moses is up on the mountain, and they are remembering those thunderings and lightnings, the thing that scared them to death. And I think they just kind of assumed, well, Moses isn't coming back. Where has he gone? When is he coming back? We don't know. And who on earth is going to lead us going forward? Because Moses, we haven't seen hide nor hair of him. We don't know where he went. They felt leaderless, and they felt lost. They made assumptions. Perhaps they assumed that Moses had been killed by the thunderings and lightnings. Maybe they thought Moses abandoned them. There's a fair bit of assumptions that they make here. I think they start to panic, probably, because they're here in the desert all on their own, what seems like all on their own. So they decide to take matters into their own hands. They begin to seek identity, a national identity, and something tangible, because here they are lost in the desert. They don't know where to go. They don't know exactly where they're going from here, and no one is here to lead them. And I think in their mind, in their fear and in their panic, they're just reaching out to find something firm to hold on to. So they begin to revert back to some things that they know, and we'll talk about some of these details here in a moment. But I think what we see here, this is an attempt to force God's presence. Because in this moment, with Moses being gone, and God is giving the law to Moses up on the mountain, they feel left out, they feel lost. They don't know where they're going from here or what this is going to look like. And I think they're doing what we all try to do in some sense, is force God's presence into their own lives, something tangible to ground them. You know, there's a cliched saying that I think applies here. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about there's a God-shaped hole in your heart, and we try to fill that with all these other things in life. And I think that's what they're trying to do here. Now, my question is, this is the next question I have. So they've been following something that looks like this whole time. The pillar of fire by night, the cloud by day. So here we are. We're going to make a representation of this. That way we can feel like we have something to worship. We can feel grounded again, right? We can feel God's presence is back with us. And I do believe they are going to make something that represents Yahweh. I don't think that they're going to try to invent some new God. Because when they make the calf, the first thing they announce is, this is the God that's led us out. So I think they're trying to make a representation of God himself. And this is what they've been following this whole time. This is what they've seen. This is what has struck fear and terror into their hearts. This is what has showed them the way. And so when it comes time to make an image of this God, a representation, why a calf? Where did that come from? I don't know. So this is the second thing that popped up in my mind, the second question. Why on earth, if we're going to make a representation of God, would they make a calf? And I'll be honest, there's a lot of theories out there. I think probably the truth is somewhat of a mix of all of them, as these things usually go. The word calf here is not just a generic calf. It's the word egel, and that specifically refers to a young bull. This is a word for a bull that was up to a year old. So a bull is what we have in mind. So a young bull, and he's got the small horns as we have in our image up here. This is what they decide to make. If you look in Egyptian mythology with all of their gods, bulls are widely represented. In fact, they have a god named Apis, and Apis is a young bull. So perhaps drawing upon their years of captivity in Egypt, they're just reverting back to what they know. Well, we've got knowledge of Apis. Oftentimes in the other Canaanite religions, Baal was often represented as a bull. Sometimes if Baal wasn't represented as a bull, based off the various nations and their ideas of Baal, he would be riding a bull. So a bull was a very common religious icon, not just in Egypt, but in all the Canaanite religions, all the Canaanite nations around there. I think even in Greek theology, they had Zeus sometimes riding a bull. A bull is a very common image. So you can start to see why culturally a bull might come to mind. One thing I think we need to understand about what idols did for people back in these days is they were more symbolic than what we think sometimes. Because we tend to think, oh, well, there's this God, and we're just going to make a picture of what this God looks like. And so they would, carve, and sometimes they did that. But oftentimes the idols themselves were more of a representation of different characteristics of whatever god they were trying to represent. So they may take some characteristics, some attributes, and they come up with an animal or a creature that represented those. And it's not necessarily that this god looks like this, but symbolically we're going to represent what we think this god is like in terms of attributes, characteristics, or personality. What you see most commonly across Egypt, Canaanite religions, is that a bull represents strength. A bull represents leadership. A bull represents fertility. And oftentimes a bull would represent royalty and kingship. Talking about that god Apis in the Egyptian religion, Apis was one of the gods of kingship. And there was a ritual where Pharaoh would have to take a drink offering from this god Apis and drink it, and he was taking in the authority from this bull god into himself. You know, when I look at this list of attributes, it starts to make a little more sense why they would think of this calf or this bull. Obviously, God is very strong, right? The thunderings and lightnings have terrified them to their core. God has been leading them out of Egypt, leading them through the wilderness. He's led them to the mountain. Fertility, a bull being a representation of fertility. One of the major blessings they receive from the Lord is fertility. And we've talked about that earlier in the book of Exodus, how their descendants just grew and grew and grew and grew. And that's part of God's promise, God's covenant with them. And then obviously royalty and kingship. I think in their mind, they thought they were doing something good. I think they thought that they were doing something to honor God, because they had these symbolic representations of things that it's not hard to see from Exodus how they came up with these ideas. And so I don't think the people in making this calf are saying, well, this is what God looks like. God looks like a bull. I think they're representing symbolically what they've observed from God. I think they had good motivations in their own mind, but they missed the plot. Another thing that's true about idols is they tended to be national icons. You would have a god of this nation, and while all these Canaanite religions, they would have many gods that they worshipped, they would typically have one where he's almost like the mascot for our nation, right? And so I think they're also seeking somewhat of a national identity here. We need a mascot. We need something we can look at that we can show other people and say, this represents us. That's not so unfamiliar to us. We've got our own national symbols, right? We have this majestic eagle flying in front of an American flag, and it makes you want to oddly put your hand over your heart. We have other national symbols, and sometimes we even take these to mythic proportions with George Washington with his belt-fed machine gun and the eagle on his shoulder. This is kind of our national icon. Breyer made this one for me. We have George Washington on a dinosaur carrying the American flag into battle. I'm sure they probably didn't have that. But anyway, we understand what it means to have a national icon. And so oftentimes these idols would be a national icon. It was a national identity. What were the results of their making this? Exodus 32:6, they rose up early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. This is a big party. When it says rose up to play, that has very sexual connotations to it. This was a very wicked party they wound up having in worship to this idol. When they made God in their own image, it led them to sin. They sinned by making it, and it led them even further to more sin. There is a travesty about this, though. And honestly, I didn't find this till just the other, and I've read this so many times in preparation for this, and I kind of missed some of this. Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 9, Moses is recounting these events. Moses talks about how he was up on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. That's a symbolic amount of time. Not that Moses wasn't literally, I believe this literally was 40 days and 40 nights, but oftentimes when you read 40 days and 40 nights in the Old Testament, we're talking about a period of testing. That's a number symbolic for a period of testing. And if that sounds like a stretch to you, well, look in Exodus 20, verse 20, what he said to the people. Moses said to the people, "Do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin." This period of time with Moses being gone, this time when they felt lost and alone and leaderless, this was a test that had been put before them. I hope maybe we can understand, maybe sympathize with them a little bit more. Not in that what they did is good, but hopefully we can start to recognize some of this in ourselves and start to not view them as just a mob with no clue what they're doing, but honestly, in their situation, we might not have done so different because probably we do some of the same things in our own life. Maybe not literally making a golden calf, but we practice idolatry in other ways, and we talk about that often in other sermons and other studies. Worship of money, worship of sex, worship of ourselves, worship of all these things in our culture. And when we think about what would have motivated them, we look at the way that they were feeling and what would have motivated them to go this route, I look at those as triggers within myself. And I think of sins that I've committed and times I've really got off the path, and I see those same kind of things. I feel lost. I feel directionless. I feel like there's no one leading me. I feel like God's presence is far from me, and I don't know when it's coming back. And I want to take that lost feeling, and I want to grab control of it, and I want to force it back into my life to have some semblance of solidarity. And I forget that could be a test. Moses told them they were going to have a test. Like us, they failed. They made this calf. They broke the commandment. We'll go through some of the events that happens after this. Moses is up getting the law, and God informs him of the calf and what the people are doing with it. And God says, "I'm going to destroy them all. I'm going to consume them all." They failed the test. They broke the commandment. Exodus 32:10, "Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation of you." So God says, you know what? I'm just going to get rid of all of them. And Moses, you're going to be the one that carries on the promise now, and I can make a great nation of you and carry it on. And God had the power to do that. Moses pleads on their behalf. And I want to take a minute to read that in verses 11 through 14. And I want to point out what some of his arguments to the Lord are here. Beginning in verse 11, "But Moses implored the Lord his God and said, 'O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt, with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, with evil intent did he bring them out, to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger and relent from this disaster against your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self and said to them, I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven. And all this land that I promised I will give your offspring, and they shall inherit it forever. And the Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken of, bringing on his people." So Moses essentially makes the argument, if you consume them, if you destroy them all in a disaster, well, then the people back in Egypt are going to see that, and they're going to think evil of you. They're going to think, well, you just brought them all this way out here to kill them out in the wilderness. And then Moses brings up the original covenant made with Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. And so what Moses is pleading for here, notice he said, and the Lord relented from the disaster. We're going to continue on talking about this, but the people didn't have forgiveness yet. We have a period of limbo here where God is withholding his judgment and his punishment, but they haven't been forgiven. This has not been atoned for yet. Now it's time for the reckoning. So Moses comes down from the mountain as God told him to, and he sees for himself all this debauchery that goes on. I think even Joshua's with him, and to them it sounded like the sound of a battle, all this partying and debauchery that's going on in worship to this idol. So Moses gets angry and breaks the tablets. This seems like such a great loss of such an important relic, but probably this is pretty symbolic of what they have done, and that they've already broken the covenant that they made just a few days before. And so, Moses gets pretty angry. He breaks the tablets. In Exodus 32, verse 20, another curiosity, he took the calf that they had made and burned it with fire and ground it to powder and scattered it on the water and made the people of Israel drink it. That sounds pretty hardcore, right? They have to drink now this idol that they made. So I had a lot of questions about this. There are many theories out there about this, and all of them seemed equally plausible. Some people think this is what's called an ordeal. So you have other places in the Old Testament, in the Old Testament law, where it's, for example, a woman who is accused of committing adultery, and she is very sure that she didn't do it, but her husband is accusing her. She can go before the priest and drink this mixture of stuff that the law commands, and if she really is guilty and she's been lying, it says her thigh will rot out, and if not, she'll be fine. That's what's known as an ordeal. It's something you drink, and then the Lord will show who's guilty or not. So perhaps it is some sort of ordeal where God is going to show who exactly is guilty of the sin and who's not. Some people think that this is a reference back to the ritual that would happen with Pharaoh drinking the drink offering from the Apis god. And so maybe those who would feel compelled to go drink this in reference back to Apis, well, once again, we would know who is really guilty of this sin and who deserves mercy. So those are two things. It could just be that Moses is really angry and he's like, you people are going to drink. I'm going to rub your nose in this. Probably it's some of all three mixed into this. So Moses asks the people, who is on the Lord's side? And so the sons of Levi gathered around Moses, and they expressed their faith. So we kind of have a little bit of Aaron realizing what he did was wrong, thankfully, because Deuteronomy chapter 9 talks about how God wanted to kill Aaron for doing this, because his lame excuse. And so the sons of Levi, so the tribe of Levi, they gather around Moses, and they express their faith. We're on the Lord's side. And so Moses commanded them to kill the idol worshippers. And it talks about you got to go and slay your brothers and your kinsmen. And it said about 3,000 people died. So these were likely the main instigators that pressured Aaron into making this idol. This would have been really tough for them to do. So now we have to deal with the sin itself. Now that we've had this moment of reckoning, this identification of who's really guilty. And Moses does something pretty amazing. He's going to go try and atone for this sin from God. In Exodus 32, verses 30 through 32, the next day Moses said to the people, you have sinned a great sin, and now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin. So Moses returned to the Lord and said, alas, this people has sinned a great sin. They have made for themselves gods of gold. But now, if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written. Moses is begging for forgiveness on behalf of the people. Now, Moses didn't commit this sin. Moses wasn't part of the idolatry going on. But Moses comes as their representative before God and is begging for God's forgiveness on them. But Moses has nothing to offer, so he offers himself. He puts himself on the line. He says, if you're not going to forgive them, blot me out of your book that you have written. God doesn't accept, but he assures Moses that he will hold each offender accountable. He will visit the sin on him at the appropriate time. I think if you look at this atonement that Moses offers, and we'll talk about this more here in a moment, we really see a foreshadowing of Christ. And I think that comes through pretty obvious. Christ committed no sin, yet he pleads to the Father and put himself on the line on our behalf. So what are the consequences of this sin now that atonement has been made? Ordination for priestly service has now been extended to the tribe of Levi. At a great cost, they had to go kill people that they loved to expunge this group of sinners. Up to this moment, we see in Exodus, I think 19, a mention of Israelite priests. So there is some group of priests in this nation that are performing some sort of religious duties. And maybe they were the same people that were really pushing the idol. And but also in the portions of the law that we've been given, the priesthood duties have been given to Aaron and his sons. And I think what we see now is a movement getting rid of all of those old priests. Aaron and his sons are now going to be the leaders, and the priestly duties are not just for Aaron and his sons, but now for the tribe of Levi. And this came at great cost to them because they had to go through and commit those executions. At the end of 32, we see that God sent a plague on the people. And some people speculate that drinking the statue is what caused that plague. But it's almost like God is going to give everyone a plague, just a reminder, like, hey, y'all let this happen in under your watch, and that can't be. And then the worst consequence of all, his presence can no longer go with him. And I want to look at a few things regarding that. In Exodus 32, verse 7, God talking to Moses, when he informs him of what's going on, he says, go down, for your people. What's significant here is through this chapter we see a distancing, God beginning to distance himself from the people. Because up till now it's been my people. God says, let my people go. And now he looks at Moses and says, your people. God is distancing himself. You know, you might hear this from parents sometimes when a kid misbehaves. One parent looks at the other and like, your son did this. God is doing that. And so what we see is God is withdrawing his presence from the people. The same God that has been among them, that has been leading them through the desert, now God is beginning to identify these people not with himself, but with Moses because of the sin that they've committed. In Exodus 32 and 34, we're going to compare that with a verse from the next chapter. God says, my angel shall go before you. And in other times it's referenced. God talking about my presence will go with you. My angel shall go before you. But look at the change in Exodus 33, verse 2. I will send an angel before you. It's no longer my angel. It's no longer my representation, the representation of my presence. I can't be among you anymore, is what God is saying. We're going to send some lesser angel now, and he's going to show you the way. It's no longer my angel, it's an angel. It's not really a demotion there. Exodus 33 and verse 3, God just comes out and says it. I will not go up among you. Why? Lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people. God's presence cannot be with sin because God is holy and God is righteous and God is just. And what we see here through these events is that God must withdraw his presence from these sinful, stiff-necked people. There's a lot of other details through here we just don't have time for, but I want to draw out just a few lessons to kind of summarize. Good motives without faith and obedience will lead to more sin. There's a lot of people in this world that think that they're doing good for other people, but they're not doing it out of faith in God. They're not doing it out of fear of the Lord. They're doing it purely driven by what their heart feels, what feels right in their heart. That will lead to more sin and more destruction as it did for these people. Like I said, I think they had good motives, but they did it apart from God's commandments, apart from the fear of God. And it led them to even more sin, and eventually it led to destruction. And what's interesting is if you think about it in terms of the presence of God, they're trying to bring the presence of God into their life without faith and obedience, actually drove the presence of God away. That's an important lesson to remember in life. We talked about this. Moses foreshadows the work of Christ, not just in his atonement, But see, there's the moment where Moses comes down from the mountain and there's a reckoning. And because Moses has already pleaded for mercy from God on behalf of the people, Moses has the moral authority to bring about some of these consequences that he does. That angry reaction that Moses has, he has some moral authority to perform those. There is a day that the clouds will open, the sky will open, and Jesus will return. And it says when he does, he's going to have a sword of fire. He's coming with flaming fire, with legions of angels. And he's going to be coming for justice. And he's going to separate those who committed sin, those who aren't his, from those who belong to him, those who are on the Lord's side. And there's going to be justice. There's going to be death. It's not going to be a pleasant scene for those who are not in Christ. There will be a reckoning. And Christ has the moral authority to do that because he has put himself on the line to make himself available for all. So we see in this chapter that Moses foreshadows the work of Christ, not just in the atonement, but also in the final judgment. And it's a great reminder for ourselves. You shall not make for yourself a carved image. This is the wording of the commandment given here. God does not want us to make representations of him within this life. Whether that be a golden calf, whether that be with money, drugs, alcohol, any type of sin that we commit, we are replacing God with those things. We're representing God in a false way. I want to look at this idea for just a moment. In Genesis 1, chapter 26, when God is going to create mankind, he says, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." The big reason why God doesn't need a statue of him, why he commanded for there not to be a graven image of him, even well-intentioned, is because God has already placed images of himself in this world. That was his original intention with making mankind, is that we would reflect his attributes in the way that we live, in the way that we deal with other people, with the way that we deal with creation. We are to show God's attributes to the world in the way that we live. And we can do it a lot better than a golden calf can. However, as we all know, mankind has sinned, including ourselves, and that gets in the way of showing that likeness. I don't have it up on the board, but Hebrews chapter 1 talks about Christ being the perfect imprint. If you want to make an accurate representation of God and his attributes, it's Christ. And God has done that by sending his Son. So let's remember, we are to be the image of God. The idol, if you want to use that term. We are to reflect his attributes, to show his glory to the world. Romans chapter 1, verses 22 through 25. Yeah, this is such an accurate description of the Israelites here. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Therefore, God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. This golden calf that they made just pales in comparison to the glory that they've already seen, the pillar of fire, the cloud, the miracles, all the wonderful, amazing things that they've seen. And this, of course, in my picture here, it looks kind of big. I don't imagine in real life this thing would have been very large because they're out in the middle of the desert. It's not like they have a full set of calf molds with them. I mean, how silly to think that could be an accurate representation, that could match up to the glory of God. And I think that's our theme for this whole section, is the presence of God and how worshiping the creature rather than the Creator, what a sad comparison. Even in the way that Paul talks about it here in Romans. He says, worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. The immense amazingness of God. And we want to worship these small things, even if it's something conceptual like money or some sinful thing. It doesn't compare. So what we're going to see in the upcoming studies, and this is the rest of this section and into the next team's study. Tonight we've talked about fabricating an image of God. When we try to fabricate an image of God, we wind up making God into an image of ourselves, and it will lead us to sin. Next Wednesday night, we'll talk about Moses seeing God's glory on the mountain. And have this golden calf in your mind as we read about the amazingness of his glory. Moses only got to see a tiny piece of it, and there was still a worry that it was going to kill him. Something I was thinking about was this eclipse we just had. And around here, we had 93.9% coverage of the sun. That means like 6.5% of this. I can't do math while I'm up here talking, right? Such a small percentage of the sun still showing, and you can't look at the thing. And it was still, it was dim, but it was still bright enough to see around you. So much of the sun covered, there's a tiny piece of it, and you couldn't even look at it. And that pales in comparison to God's glory. And so next Wednesday night, Marty Barris is going to bring us a discussion of what happens next. Moses seeing God's glory. We talked about tonight how God is withdrawing his presence and basically saying, my presence can't go with you anymore. You're too sinful. I can't be around you. And Moses begs and pleads for God to come with him and asks God to see his glory. And he only gets to see a tiny piece of it. And then the Wednesday after that, as Moses comes down and the covenant is renewed, the people promise again they're going to do good. There's a whole section of text talking about how Moses, his face shone bright, and how he had to wear a veil for the people looking at him. And so what we see over this whole section is this idea of us being imagers of God, right? We see Moses seeing God's glory, the true nature of his glory, even though it was a tiny piece, and then Moses himself being a reflection of that. And through this month, we will learn how we are to be a reflection of God's image, because that's the purpose for which he created us. And then the next team, I won't get into their talks yet, but how can God's presence be among this stiff-necked people? There's got to be some sort of system, some sort of housing set up where we can have God's holy, righteous glory among the stiff-necked and sinful people. And that's what the tabernacle will get into. And through all of these, what we see, and we'll talk about in all of these sections, is how the physical things we see, the religiosity around us, the elements of the Jewish religion and even Christianity and the way we live our lives, these are reflections, earthly reflections of heavenly things. And that's what it means to be an imager, is that the way we live our life is an earthly reflection of heavenly things. And those themes will percolate all through here. I hope you've gotten something out of the discussion tonight. There's a whole lot else we could have talked about. Every time I read Aaron's excuse, it just cracks me up. Well, we put it in and just out it came, and it cracks me up. And that could be a whole sermon itself about the excuses we make. A lot that could be talked about. Christ tonight is before the Father pleading for you. He is pleading to God to withhold his hand of destruction, the destruction that we all deserve because of our sin. And Christ put himself on the line and sacrificed himself. He sacrificed his position. He sacrificed himself so that we could join him, that we could be part of him, that we could show that we are on the Lord's side and we could be spared from destruction. If you need the help of the church, whether it be partaking in Christ's death, burial, and resurrection through baptism, or if you need the prayers of the church, we can help you with that. Please come forward if you need the help in any way this evening as we sing our song of invitation.